Months of saber-rattling culminated over the past week in the U.S. first targeted killing of a high-ranking foreign military official since World War II, and in an unprecedented direct attack by Iran on U.S. bases in Iraq. Are the two sides now ready to back down? Or could Iran's thirst for retaliation following the American drone attack on Revolutionary Guard leader Qassem Soleimani spark further escalation? The collateral damage following Soleimani's killing was immediate and extensive. Iraq's parliament demanded foreign troops leave the country, a departure that could threaten the fight against Islamic State. And Iran announced that it would no longer be bound by key provisions of the 2015 nuclear agreement. Trump versus Iran on the brink of war? And it's a pleasure to welcome our guests to discuss that question. Matthew Karitschnig is Chief Europe Correspondent for Politico. And he says President Trump has restored a modicum of order to the Middle East by making it clear to Iran's leadership that it can't act with impunity. And it's a pleasure to welcome Ali Fathollah-Nejad. He's a German-Iranian political scientist working with the Brookings Institution in Doha. And he says Soleimani's killing was a major blow to the Islamic Republic. And it has opened Pandora's box, leaving the Middle East in uncharted territory. And we're very glad to have Andrea Hoffman with us. She's a Middle East expert from the German weekly magazine Focus. And she says killing General Soleimani has harmed U.S. interests in the region and instead helped the Iranian regime. So let me begin by asking all of you, please, to say just very briefly whether you think what we're seeing now, also following the speech on Wednesday by U.S. President Trump, is a real hiatus in the saber-rattling or a temporary respite. Let me start with you, Matthew.
I think it probably is a real hiatus in terms of the big strikes, the big public strikes with, the U.S. taking out a prominent general and then the Iranians responding directly where there was no question about who was responsible. That said, I would be surprised if we see a cessation on the Iranian side of these attacks through proxies in the region, which we've seen for years, and I expect that will continue in the coming months.
How do you see it?
Well, I think after the killing of Soleimani, the Pandora's box was wide open. But now, after the so-called revenge attack of the Iranians, it has been a bit more closed. But it doesn't mean that things are going to calm down totally. I think we're going to see a lot of escalation also from the Iranian side, also in view of elevating their leverage in view of possible negotiations with the United States. That is in the realm of possibilities, according to what also Trump said.
Andrea Hoffman?
Well, I think the situation today is less dramatic than it was yesterday, which is good. But as we have different players inside each field, we might not be sure that it is not going to wrap up again.
Thank you very much. To dive a bit deeper on all of those points, let us now take a look at who Qassem Soleimani was and why his killing has provoked such outrage in Iran.
General Soleimani. Next to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, he was the most important man in Iran. He pulled the strings in the background. His mission, to extend Iran's influence in the region and to irritate the enemy, the USA. His tool, the Al-Quds Brigades, Iran's special forces for covert and foreign operations. They stir up the entire Middle East. Soleimani's fighters are believed to have killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers. Lately, the brigades were in action fighting against Syrian rebels and IS fighters, as well as in Iraq, supporting Shiite militias. Iran's supreme leader Khamenei calls Soleimani a living martyr of the revolution and has called his killing by the U.S. their greatest strategic mistake. For the U.S. leadership, Soleimani is a terrorist. His assassination an act of self-defense. The fronts have hardened like never before. How far will Iran's revenge go?
So, Ali, Ayatollah Khamenei referred to the retaliatory strike by Iran as a slap in the face. That seems fairly moderate. Nobody was killed through the attacks on the bases, in view of the fact that you say the killing of Soleimani was a major blow for Iran. So let me ask you to say once again whether you think Iran is really ready to stand down, as President Trump said yesterday. Won't there be pressure from Iranian hardliners, at least, for other additional retaliatory measures?
Well, this revenge, this kind of revenge, what the Iranians call hard revenge, was precisely for domestic consumption vis-à-vis those hardline elements in Iran who were calling for a swift and severe response to the killing. But the Iranians know fully well that they cannot afford a full-blown war with the United States that might jeopardize their regime's survival. So this is why the attacks that we had on the Iraqi base housing U.S. troops from the Iranian side was well calibrated in order to avoid civilian or any kind of casualties that would have potentially triggered an escalation that would have been unpredictable.
Iran often tends to rely on attacks by its proxies, by a militia who take their direction from Tehran. Do you think we're likely to see attacks by them in the coming weeks and months?
That's possible, because the Iranians have also signaled before the recent Revenge Act, they've signaled to their proxies that they don't want the proxies to act on their own. Because, as I said, this would have opened, a potential route toward escalation that Tehran didn't want. So they took matters into their own hand and did what they did. But in terms of the Islamic Republic losing or having a major blow with the killing of Soleimani, Iran has lost its main man in the region, who was the coordinating force, was directing Iranian foreign policy in the region, and as such, the structuring force of Iranian foreign policy has now disappeared. Now there is some reorganization of Iranian foreign policy in the region. And there are some, of course, risks in terms of people or groups who might act on their own.
So, Matthew, you said in your opening statement that the killing of Soleimani restores order to the Middle East. In fact,
modicum of order.
Modicum of order. In fact, both President George W. Bush and President Obama decided not to take out Soleimani precisely because they feared it would unleash disorder. And if we look at the justification that was provided yesterday to the U.S. Congress by the President and by the Trump administration, it departs pretty far from the international law standard about when such a preemptive killing in self-defense might be justified. Is that really the way to restore order?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that George W. Bush also decided to go to war in Iraq. So I'm not sure that his judgment, should be the standard.
Right. In fact, doesn't this remind us, in a way, of all of the arguments he made about weapons of mass destruction?
Not really. And I think the reason is that if you look over the past 6 months, there's been a steady escalation on the part of the Iranians, shooting down the American drones, attacking the Saudi refinery over the summer. And, I think the United States response to that, in the view of many in the U.S. even, many Republicans even, was a little bit too soft. I mean, if people might remember that at one point Trump scrambled jets to go and retaliate for the downing of the drones, and then at the last minute he decided not to do it and called them back because he thought that the deaths that might result from a U.S. strike would not be commensurate with the downing of the drones or with the attack on the refinery. So I think what we've seen here is a situation where the Iranians kept pushing the envelope and thinking, okay, well, if he's not going to respond, and Trump has been on the record saying he wants to pull the U.S. out of the Middle East, he wants to get out of Iraq, he wants to get out of Afghanistan, he doesn't want these, forever wars, these endless wars, as some people call them. So I think what that led to is the situation where the Iranians kept provoking and provoking, and Soleimani certainly was the architect of this strategy. But I think it's worth remembering that the U.S. has been in kind of a soft war, sometimes hard war with Iran since 1979. And I think what this attack does is say, look, I'm unpredictable from Trump's perspective. You think you know what I'm going to do, but you don't. And, you know, some people have said it's the sort of I'm crazier than you strategy. And I think that that has restored a sense of, okay, you know, there are red lines, and the red line was always going to be the killing of an American, which happened in the lead up to this attack and the siege of the U.S. embassy in Iraq by Iranian proxies. And that, I think, reminded a lot of people in Washington, probably Trump certainly, who's of a generation that remembers, you know, the taking of the U.S. embassy in Tehran.
Right.
So I think this has all kind of led us to this point.
Andrea, if we stay with the idea of order and disorder, isn't predictability a very crucial aspect of order? And do you see any clear, predictable strategy from the U.S. side here in the actions if we look back over all the different events that Matthew's just listed?
No, I don't. I think just like at the Iranian side, there are different people within the U.S. government following up different strategies, and it's not very coherent. And we have the people that would like to see a regime change in Iran. We have the people who were in favor of the JCPOA.
That's the agreement between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, to essentially contain Iran's nuclear aspirations.
Exactly. We have a president who is constantly changing his mind and is not very predictable at all. We've seen that in Syria. You just mentioned the attack that was cancelled in last minute. So, no, it's pretty erratic.
You said in your opening statement that you think, if anything, the killing of Soleimani would advance Iran's interests in the region rather than the U.S. Why is that?
No, I said it's against the U.S. interests in the region. When I look at Iraq and see how the Iraqi parliament has voted against American troops, that is against American interests in the region. And that's why I think the killing of Soleimani was not a very wise thing to do on the American side. I think it helped the Iranian regime in the sense that they had a lot of problems with internal turmoil in the last weeks and month. You know, we saw the protests on the streets, and they were continuing. And now we have a momentum where the population is concerned about something else, and that's the threat from outside. And so Iran and the leadership has contained this unrest, and that's why it's favoring the government.
Ali, all of the Iranian leaders who have spoken since the U.S. targeted killing of Soleimani have said basically there is one central thing they want, and that is for the U.S. to get out of the region. Is that more likely to happen now?
Well, I'm not sure, because although certainly one could argue that all this has not been to the benefit of U.S. interests in the region, but the vote by the Iraqi parliament to call for the expulsion of all foreign troops is non-binding, and it has been voted by a Shia majority parliament in a session where the Sunnis and Kurds were boycotting. And this kind of Shia government is very close to Iran. So it was using the momentum of this killing to fan the flames of anti-Americanism, and also to divert attention from the popular uprising that we've seen in Iraq that has been quite huge since October. So this is a very, cynical game. But of course, there's a lot of pressure now, whether the U.S., or what will happen with the U.S. troop presence in Iraq. But if the U.S. withdraws, in terms of the balance of power, logically, this is going to play into the hands of the Iranians, and it's long-standing Iranian interest for many, many years since the revolution that they call both so-called moderates and hardliners for the withdrawal of the U.S. military presence from the region.
And certainly there's a...
Paradoxically, that's what Soleimani really wanted. He wanted the U.S. out of Iraq. You know, he was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq war, and that's his big thing, that Iran should dominate Iran and the U.S. should be kicked out. So
dominate Iraq. Matthew, many people would say, well, this is one area where Trump's interests maybe converge with those of the Iranians. Trump has said again and again he wants to take the U.S. out of the endless foreign wars, particularly in the Middle East. He wants to pull back troops. He unilaterally pulled troops out of northern Syria to the great distress, for instance, of their European and Kurdish allies. So could we possibly see, in fact, the U.S. essentially handing over the Middle East to Iran and Russia?
Well, I think a lot of Americans would be happy for that to happen, quite frankly. I mean, given all of the resources that the United States has put into these wars over the past 20 plus years. I mean, I do think it's interesting that a lot of people say, oh, well, this was, you know, Soleimani's grand plan all of the time, and the underlying assumption there is, oh, well, his grand plan, you know, this military genius, this has been such a success. But it actually hasn't been a success. It's been a complete disaster. I mean, Iran is involved in every major conflict in the region now. None of the other countries there support it, even in Iraq, where there are large, you know, Shia militias there. And the Shia population, obviously. People were out in the streets before this. The Shia population was out in the streets protesting Iranian influence. So you could also argue, well, you know, let them have it. You know, good luck to Iran running Iraq if the United States leaves. And I would also add the United States only has 5,000 troops left in Iraq right now. The U.S. had pulled them out before, put them in to fight ISIS, so which is a Sunni movement, obviously. So, you know, if Iran, which is completely, you know, under pressure economically now, wants to go into Iraq and fight ISIS alone without the support of, you know, Western powers like the United States, well, you know, more power to them, I think, is what a lot of people in Washington would say.
Interestingly enough, Matthew just talked about Iraqis protesting Iranian influence. Well, in fact, many Iranians had been out on the street in the fall protesting their hardline government. Now we're seeing them all apparently united in anger against the U.S. and in mourning for Soleimani. Have we succeeded, in fact, in dampening that resistance to the very regime that many people in the U.S. administration would like to overturn?
Let me briefly say something about the Iraq issue. I think there can be no illusion whatsoever that in Iraq, both the United States and Iran are deeply unpopular and are considered to be malign foreign forces. I mean, after all, the U.S. has initiated 2003 invasion that has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of lives all over Iraq. So this is something that is, of course, you know, still there. And more recently, we've seen the malign influences of Iran through the proxies. When it comes to the Iranian protest movement that has been unprecedented in November, where, according to authorities' figures, only 200,000 people were out in the streets. They were the most important protests since the revolution in Iran. I think the structural grievances that have fueled the protests, both socioeconomic and political, are still there. They're under the surface. So we cannot, you know, we should not be diverted from this kind of hype around the images of the massive funerals for Soleimani, that all of a sudden everything has changed in Iran, there is national unity, and everything is going to be, you know, fine. I think sooner or later we're going to see the reemergence of those popular protests because of the existing and ongoing grievances of the Iranians. So this particular moment overshadows also a lot of realities in Iran.
Now, those grievances, of course, among other things, reflect distress in Iran over the economic situation. Let us now take a look at one soundbite from the speech that Donald Trump gave on Wednesday, in which he said that his government will impose new and even tougher sanctions on Iran.
Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. They must now break away from the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place.
Andrea, what we got in yesterday's speech from President Trump was basically an ultimatum not only to Iran, but also to Europe. How are the European parties, including Germany, to the Iran agreement likely to react to this? He's basically saying the old deal is dead, long live a new deal. Do you see a real path forward to get that kind of a deal, and what would the European role be?
Well, it's the Trump recipe, right? Rip up an old deal and try to fix a new one, put the Trump label on it. He did that with NAFTA. I have my doubt it's going to work with Iran and with Europe, because the Iranians have experienced that the U.S. might not be trusted. They're very reluctant. Europe has seen now that the points of view are very far apart, and they're pretty upset about that. I don't know if I was the Iranians and I should give them some advice, I would vote for a photo op with Khamenei and Trump, and then maybe he would be as nice to them as he was with North Koreans.
I don't think this is going to happen after they killed Soleimani, which was a close protege and close advisor to Khamenei. So this is not going to happen, the photo op story.
What has been the reaction to the speech? We heard Trump say he's going to double down on economic sanctions. Certainly, the Iranians have said again and again they are only sticking with the nuclear deal if they get the economic benefits that were promised to them. So is there any chance of a new deal?
Well, I mean, hopefully, this latest escalatory and macabre escalation we've been witnessing is going to, put the realization on both fronts that the only way forward is a diplomatic solution, and maybe, hopefully, we're going to see perhaps some momentum for the prospect of secret talks between the United States and Iran going forward. It cannot be public, because it would, this is not something that the Iranians would feel comfortable after the killing of Soleimani to engage in. But the Iranians have to do something about the sanctions that is really, destroying the economy. And they have huge economic difficulties, so they have to do something about the sanctions. And what Trump said may be an opener for such talks.
Matthew, Trump said he would double down on economic sanctions. Do you really see anything new in what he's offering? Will it work to only hit Iran with sticks, or don't we need a few carrots to possibly get a new deal?
I think the reality is that the existing sanctions are so severe that there's really not much more than that the U.S. and that the West can do. So I think that was largely symbolic. I think the message he was sending was, I'm not going to escalate now if you don't escalate, and everything else was sort of, a face-saving exercise. That said, I think that it's clear, and it's been clear to the Europeans, if you speak to them off the record, that the Iranian nuclear deal was dead anyway, died the moment that the United States pulled out of it.
It's not what they're saying this week.
It's not what they're saying publicly, but I think that, it's functionally not working. Iran also said this week that it was pulling out of the deal, that it wasn't going to adhere anymore to the constraints around the enrichment of uranium and so forth.
But it's leaving inspectors in the country for now.
For now, and this is, the Europeans always kind of hold hope, that these, but on the ground, in terms of, if you look at what Iran has done in the region since 2015, it's difficult to say, and Soleimani was the architect of this strategy, it's difficult to say that the deal was really working. And I think that unless, the Europeans, the French President Emmanuel Macron, rather, has been very active in trying to act as a mediator here, unless the Europeans can somehow convince the Iranians to, come to the table, perhaps in secret talks or in some other way, and to make real concessions in terms of the nuclear program, because that, at the end of the day, is what this is really about. I don't think that you're going to see much change here unless the domestic pressure in Iran really starts to threaten the regime.
Andrea, another thing that Trump said is that he will be talking to the NATO leadership. He pointed out the U.S. is no longer dependent on energy from the Middle East, and that maybe it's time for NATO to get more involved. Can you see that happening?
I think we're talking about money there. So this is Trump's way to put pressure on NATO and its members because he wants other members to have more financial burden there. But I do not see that happening in this situation at all.
Ellie, if I can just take us briefly back to our title, and we have about 30 seconds. On the brink of war is the question we asked. What do you think?
I think the chances of a war are much higher than the past few years, but neither the United States nor Iran want a full-blown war. So hopefully this provides us for some avenue for a hopefully less militaristic outcome.
Thanks to all of you for being with us, and thanks to you out there for tuning in. See you soon.